Hey, how's it going? In this video, I'm going to show you the basics of using watercolors. So first things first, you're going to need to have a piece of watercolor test paper or your sketchbook, a watercolor set, a brush. You can have a few different sizes of brushes. I'm just using the small one that came with my watercolor set. And you're going to need a cup of water and a paper towel. So going ahead and getting started here, I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to dip it into the water. And I'm going to choose a color. I think I'm going to do red to start us off, just a regular old red. So we're using that water on the brush and getting the color wet. Now remove the extra paint, clean your brush, get some of that extra water off so it's not super soaking wet. You never want to paint with a brush that's too wet unless you're painting a really big area that needs a lot of color. So the first technique I'm going to show you is called wet on dry. You'll see what I mean here. Basically, we're taking wet paint and putting it on dry paper. So I'm reforming my bristles. Go into the color, so we're using red here, and then you want to just get the very tip of the paintbrush with color. You don't want to soak the entire thing or else it can get kind of messy. So from here, I'm pinching the brush and just very, very gently using my whole arm to create movement here as I'm working across the paper. So with this technique, you can just make nice simple shapes. Practice this a little bit, having control over the brush, trying to create shapes and straight lines and things like that. Now I want to change colors, so I'm going to clean my brush, I'm going to dry it off, put it to the side. Never leave your brush soaking in the water, always take it out and dry it off. So I'm going to do the same technique again, the wet on dry. I'm going to get the blue wet this time. I'm going to tap off some extra paint so it's not crazy wet. And then I'm going to start filling in this shape, working from the inside outward. I find this to be the easiest way to fill in a shape. Work from the inside, and from there, you'll kind of have a little puddle of paint that you can sort of push around. Work your way towards those edges very, very gently. Very patient here when you're trying to fill in a shape and not go outside the lines too much. Now, the good thing is that our paint isn't too wet, so it's not going to be super easy to just mess it up and go outside the lines just like that. Just work slowly and carefully. Clean your brush and dry it off. Now this next technique that we're doing is called wet on wet. So basically this means that you're getting the paper wet first before you add color. So I'm going to take my brush, dip it into the water, get some extra water off, very important. Don't want a soaking wet brush, just a little damp. And then go ahead and put some water on the paper. Now it's going to be hard to see where the water is. Sometimes you can turn your head and see it in the light. The water will reflect the light in the room. Dip into your color and then touch it to the water and it'll spread out. It'll kind of bleed across the paper wherever you put that water. This is really cool for creating big swirly areas of watercolor. So wherever you tap that color, it's going to sort of bleed across the water that you put on the paper. Now remember, you don't want to have too much water on the paper or else it might run. Just a little bit. Use that paper towel a lot to take off the excess. So I'm going to fill this circle with water here. And then I'm going to go into my color. I'm going to use blue this time. I'm going to just tap it. And it's going to spread around that shape. If your water is thinner, it's not going to spread as much. But if your water is too thick, it might run. So practice this a little bit to find that balance that works for you. This is also very handy for covering large areas of your watercolor paper. And still I'm working from the center and working my way outwards so that it doesn't go outside of the lines. So I'm going to do this again. I'm going to make a big messy shape here. I'm using more water this time and you can see how that color just spreads around. So I'm cleaning off my brush, tapping off the extra. So let's say that we want to blend some colors together. Let's say we want to make an orange from the yellow and the red. I'm going to go into my yellow. I like to start with a lighter color first because sometimes it's hard to put, let's say, yellow on top of red. It might not show up as much. So I'm putting some yellow down. I'm going to go into my red, and that yellow is still wet. So this is basically wet on wet here. We're taking the red and then putting it on top of the yellow, which is still very wet. And those colors will kind of bleed together. And then you can sort of swirl them around, as opposed to, let's say, taking, this yellow right here is dry. So if we put wet red on top of dry yellow, it's not going to bleed around so much. So both techniques are useful for different scenarios. As always, clean your brush in between. You don't want to dirty the yellow paint, which is very easy to do. So just to sort of reiterate this idea again, it'll look different when you do blue on top of yellow than when you do yellow on top of blue. Because yellow is a lighter color, blue will overpower it very easily. However, yellow is going to have a hard time overpowering the blue. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to make two stripes here. One's yellow and one's blue. And I'm going to go into the yellow and put it on top of the blue. Both these colors are fairly damp. They're not soaking wet, but they're not completely dry either. So here goes yellow on top of blue. It's going to gradually create a nice green color. Yellow is a very weak color, so it's not going to make a whole lot of change very fast. But I'm going to keep building it up, making a really pretty green. Now on the opposite end, if you put blue on top of yellow, it changes it very, very fast. So you're getting more of a bluish green here. Now just to show you what these greens look like in comparison to the standard green in your watercolor set, this green looks a little bit like this. So there's different kinds of greens that you can make. You might want to mix yellow and blue together to make green, or just use the green that comes with your set. It's all about your preferences and what you're trying to do. Now here's another important thing that you need to keep in mind, and that's putting two colors right next to each other. If you're somebody who likes to work quickly, keep in mind that sometimes with watercolor you need to wait for things to dry. For example, let's say that I have these two little squares here. I want one to be yellow and one to be blue. So I'm going to go ahead and paint one square blue, and this paint is fairly wet. I'm being very, very careful putting it up against the edge there, trying not to go outside of the lines. Just pushing the paint around very gently. I'm trying to make sure that the edge between these two squares stays clean. Okay, so clean my brush, get the extra water off, and I'm going to go into my yellow. So I want this square on the left to be yellow. Because that blue there is still kind of wet, what you're going to notice is that the yellow and blue sort of leak together a little bit. They're going to bleed around. Sometimes you might want that. Like let's say you're drawing a beach and you want the blue of the water to kind of blend in with the yellow of the sand. You might want that to happen. But sometimes if you're doing furniture and things like that, you don't want your colors to bleed. Now this blue right here in that circle is dry. So I can take that yellow and I can go all around, and those colors are not really going to bleed together at all because I let that blue dry first. So keep that in mind. If you don't want your colors to bleed, make sure you let one color dry before you add more color next to it.